What you looking for?
I'm just trying to get this document
I've got it right here.
ready to go. It's not cooperating with me like it usually does. I think I can do it. Maybe not. I'll do the whole thing. Okay. So let's begin. A warm welcome to each and every one of you, dear friends of creation. So with a plethora of Zoom meetings available, thank you for choosing to be with us. And may you be well, and may you find peace. I'm Lynn Lyle, president of Interfaith Creation Care of the Triangle, here with our co-sponsors, Charles Coble from Orange Chatham Interfaith Care for Creation, and Sue Woodling from Campaign Nonviolence NC. We are looking forward with great anticipation to our conversation with Dr. Ryan Emanuel about environmental racial justice in a time of climate change and pandemic. And we're looking forward to participating in a land recognition presented by Danny Bell. Tonight, we're recording the event, so please stop your video if you don't wish to appear. And the recording will be available on our website in the near future, and I hope you'll share it with your friends. So we're also live on Facebook. To avoid noises of feedback and rowdy children and spouses, everyone has or will be soon muted, and we ask you to keep yourself muted. Ryan will take your questions from the Zoom chat box and from Facebook comments. And thanks to our communications team for helping with the Zoom tonight. I'd like to ask Tosif Assis, Ralph Earl, and Claire Cozen to please raise a hand and keep it up so we can see who you are. And thanks especially to Tosif, who's actually getting married this Saturday, just in several days. And he found the time during his wedding week to handle registration, email reminders, and the Zoom tonight. Tosif, please thank your bride for us. And we're so happy for you. Now, let's hear from Sue Woodling about Campaign Nonviolence. Sue?
Okay. Campaign Nonviolence NC is a part of the Campaign Nonviolence long-term movement that was developed by Pache Bene, and it was launched nationwide in September 2014 with 240 nonviolent actions around the country. Last year, we had 3,600 events worldwide. In 2015, various faith and community organizations in the Raleigh area joined this movement, and we began to work in collaboration. Both the Raleigh City Council and the Governor Cooper have proclaimed a Campaign Nonviolence NC week for the past 3 years, which occurs the 3rd week of September. We've asked the city and the governor to proclaim it as Campaign Nonviolence NC Week again this year, and we will hold a forum on September 21st. And as we commemorate the tragic anniversary of the Hiroshima atomic bombing on this day, we need to commit to taking action and to walk that path of nonviolence. So we invite you to become involved with Campaign Nonviolence, which is a grassroots movement to mainstream active nonviolence using the vision of Martin Luther King Jr. that calls us to become people of nonviolence and to resolve our conflicts nonviolently. So it's motivated by a desire for justice where human beings relate with one another justly and lovingly in all actions. And Campaign Nonviolence envisions a culture that connects the often separate efforts for change. It connects the link between war, poverty, racism, the climate issue, and the epidemic of violence. And these monumental challenges are intimately connected, and they need to be solved in an integral way. So we really hope you become a part of Campaign Nonviolence. This year, we are focusing on climate issues, and we're very happy to be a part of this event this evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Now for an update on ICCT activities via a quick tour on our website that was brilliantly created and tirelessly managed by our webmaster, Ralph Earl, and Vice President Gail Powell. So I think you're going to be able to see the home page now. There it is. So, next you will see, here is the mission, and you can see that we are guided by faith, informed by science, and focused on environmental justice. And here is our message to our Black and brown neighbors near and far as we protest systemic racism and violence and death unfairly to people of African American, Native American, and Hispanic backgrounds. And here is our program tonight, and here is the ICCT position statement. And now I'm going to have to go back to Ralph. Can you help me get back to my page so I can read some notes? Well, no, I know what I'll do. I have a print copy here, and I didn't realize I couldn't share my screen with this. So we're doing well. We should be back on the ICCT position statement on phasing out HFCs. You can show that tile right there. If you go on our website, you'll see this. And this was researched and authored by ICCT board member Russell Outcalt. He's here with us tonight. It supports the phasing out of HFCs, super potent greenhouse gases, used in refrigeration and air conditioning. This solution is named in the book Drawdown as the #1 most powerful among 80 solutions, all needed to reverse global warming. Who would have thought that this is #1? Good news is that ICCT's letter to the editor about this was published in the News and Observer on July 28th. So we are beginning to get the word out about this. You are invited to contact your members of Congress to urge them to support the bipartisan AIM Act, providing for this phase out. Republicans and Democrats in balanced numbers have introduced, sponsored, and co-sponsored the bills in both the Senate and the House. Currently, no members of Congress from North Carolina are co-sponsors of the bills, although some do support them. The link that you're seeing in our website right now, the blog, is our position paper and sample letters you can print and mail, and brief scripts for telephoning. Finally, ICCT has launched a 3-part Zoom drawdown webinar series. So Ralph, you may want to go to that blog and show it. in addition to the three-part series, we're also going to offer a single session webinar. The Drawdown webinars deliver a hopeful, inspiring message about solutions to climate change. We hear so much depressing news about climate change. Well, here's some hope, and it's based on a book many of you know, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And Gail Powell, with the help of her ICCT team, developed the webinars, and she has already presented them to a group of 40 at West Raleigh Presbyterian Church last month. Now, if you're interested in exploring the possibility of bringing these webinars with live trained ICCT presenters to your faith community by Zoom, contact Gail at ICCT's email address, which has been entered on the chat bar. And it's also on the website on the Contact Us page. So please join us in these endeavors, both the webinars and the advocacy for phasing out HFCs. We're so grateful that you are squarely facing this mounting and relentless climate emergency, with COVID-19 and racial injustice rightfully requiring our attention at the same time. We know they're all connected, and we know that the well-being of all creation and our grandchildren depends on it. So without further delay, I'd like to thank Amy Smith for planning tonight's program. Amy is an ICCT board member and director of philanthropy at Conservation Trust for North Carolina. She will introduce our speakers. Amy, thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. We'll begin with introducing Danny Bell, who's going to do our land acknowledgement this evening. Danny is the immediate past president of the Triangle Native American Society and has a deep and long history of being involved in Indigenous affairs and related to both Chapel Hill and the state. For 14 years, Danny worked for the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs and UNC Chapel Hill for 27 years, where he maintained a focus on American Indian students, American Indian and Indigenous studies, and engagement between UNC and North Carolina tribes and communities. Danny also served 8 years as a member of the NC State Advisory Council on Indian Education. We're so happy to have Danny with us tonight to offer land acknowledgement. Danny's land acknowledgement tonight will focus on the entire state of North Carolina. For those unfamiliar with the land acknowledgement, this is a statement that recognizes the Indigenous people that originally stewarded and cared for the land that we today inhabit. We would be remiss to have an honest conversation about environmental racism without acknowledging that the land we use today was stolen from Indigenous people and tribes. Danny, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Danny, your microphone is muted. We can't hear you.
Could you start over, please, Danny?
Hey, Danny, we're trying to unmute you, but I think you have to.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, could you start over, Danny? We didn't hear anything yet.
I'm sorry. With respect for the creation, I'll read this land acknowledgement. The land we're on today is the ancestral land of many indigenous tribes. The triangle sits on the border of the Siouan, Tuscarora, and Saponi territories. Over the past 14,000 years, this area was used for family life, nourishment, stewardship, faith, ceremony, and healing. For the past 500 years, Native American communities across North Carolina and this region have demonstrated resistance in the face of sustained displacement, removal, and complex traumatic and violent efforts to separate Indigenous and American Indian people from their culture and their land. Today, North Carolina recognizes this broad contemporary Indigenous land as Coharie, Cherokee, Halawasaponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi, Saponi, Waccamaw-Siouan, with American Indians living in all 100 counties and urban areas. I invite you to learn about our Indigenous people and support the recognition and inclusion of the Native American Indian people in this area and in North Carolina in your research and engagement and in the mission and service of your programs and activities. May we be successful caregivers, partners, and stewards of the creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. That was very insightful and meaningful. Thank you for sharing that with us. I hope that the land acknowledgement tonight will provide us all an opportunity to reflect on how we can be better allies and will inspire us to ongoing awareness and action. It's my honor to introduce to you all this evening tonight's speaker, Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Ryan is an associate professor and faculty scholar at NC State in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. Ryan earned his bachelor's degree from Duke University, studying geology, and then subsequently earned a master's and his PhD in environmental science, both from University of Virginia. Ryan is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe, which is the largest tribe in the eastern United States. Ryan very recently won the very prestigious residential fellowship from the National Humanities Center. He will spend a year writing a book to further his research project entitled Water in the Lumbee World, Environmental Justice, Indigenous Rights, and the Transformation of Home. If you've not read the research project that Ryan's already put together, I would encourage you to do so. And I look forward to Ryan's book being published and sharing that with us, hopefully in the next year or so. Ryan also is the 2019 recipient of the North Carolina Environmental Network's Steve Wing International Environmental Justice Award. One final housekeeping item before we get started this evening with Ryan. If you will send in questions while Ryan is presenting through the chat feature or through Facebook, we will circle back and answer those at the completion of Ryan's presentation. We'll get to as many as time will allow for tonight. We're so very happy to have Ryan join us this evening. And like was mentioned earlier, this has been a long time coming. We've been working on this for many months and have had delays from COVID, but we're happy to finally be together and have Ryan join us this evening. Ryan, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Amy. And thank you, Danny, for the land acknowledgement and welcoming us all and calling us into relationship with that statement. I'm going to share a screen because as an academic, that's what I do. So can somebody just let me know if you can see my slide on the screen?
Looks great.
It's up there.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, so thank you all for inviting me to speak, and thanks for attending, everyone in the audience. I'm really grateful for these organizations' collective focus on environmental justice right now. It's very timely. So I'm a Lumbee Indian, and we are sometimes called the people of the dark water. And this is because our namesake river, which you can see in the slide here, the Lumbee or the Lumber River, flows naturally with dark colored water. I say it's natural because this is not polluted water. It is supposed to be this color. If you've heard me speak before, you know the scientific reason for this is because it's full of dissolved organic matter, like a rich cup of tea. So for centuries, the dark water and the impenetrable swamps, and you can see the swamp forest surrounding the river here, made this an inhospitable place to outsiders, but it was a very safe place for indigenous peoples. And we survived here and we thrived despite the onslaught of colonization. If you're not familiar with our territory, here's a brief map to orient you. In the left panel, you can see an outline of North Carolina, and the Lumbee River watershed is roughly centered on that red circle in the southeastern part of North Carolina. The map below the state of North Carolina is the watershed for the Lumbee River. That's all the land that drains into the river. So it starts with its headwaters up in the sand hills and then flows out into the coastal plain proper. And the various colors represent different land cover types: forest, farmlands, urban areas. And although it's a very flat terrain compared to the Piedmont and the mountains, there's still a lot of texture in the plain, in the watershed, and most of that involves the river and its tributaries in some way. So in fact, a lot of the biodiversity in the coastal plain of North Carolina and other southeastern states actually lives in these riverine corridors where we have swamps. So plant animal biodiversity is highly concentrated in these areas. Because of the richness of the land and the plants and animals that inhabit these wetland forests, this has been a center of indigenous populations for thousands of years. So here in the beginning, I want to make sure that everybody understands exactly what I mean when I say the word indigenous, and so or indigenous peoples. I thought that I would share this quote by UCLA professor and Turtle Mountain Chippewa citizen Dwayne Champagne. And Professor Champagne described being indigenous in this way. So his quote is, "The people belong to the land rather than the land belonging to the people." And what he is saying is that indigenous peoples have unique relationships with place. Their language, their cultures, their histories, and even their sciences are deeply rooted to specific rivers, mountains, bays, forests. These are the places that make the people who they are. And these relationships are incredibly important. So this bond or these relationships are very familiar to my people, to the Lumbee. And I've highlighted a couple of quotes that we have about ourselves that share in this description. The first one is from the late Ms. Ruth Rebels, who is quoted in a well-known Lumbee history called The Only Land I Know by saying, "There's more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things were not bought and paid for with money." Now, Ms. Ruth was talking about a historic building on the campus of what is now UNC Pembroke, but her point about ownership is relevant to our land and water as well. So Lumbee people may not own the deed to the vast majority of our homeland in Robeson County or Hope County or Cumberland County or Scotland County or that surrounding area that we call home. But nevertheless, these places are precious to us. And so the second quote is actually by a fictional character in an outdoor drama that some of you may have seen or heard of, Strike at the Wind. This was an outdoor drama that Lumbee people produced and performed annually for many years. And the narrator in this drama is called the leader. And he or she says, "Before our people was the spirit of all people. And it taught us that the greatest thing is not to possess, but to belong." And so I think that's a really powerful statement. Together, these two quotes remind us that we're Lumbee people because we belong to our land, our water, our families, and our tribe. And these places and these relationships are precious to us, and they're what make us, part of the things that make us who we are today. So this relationship between water and living things has always fascinated me. I often wear the hat of a hydrologist, and I've had the privilege of studying water in all its forms in some really amazing places over the course of my career. So we spent years in my research group studying snowmelt in the northern Rocky Mountains and learning how pine forests make use of melted snow that is stored deep in soils during the long, dry growing season, the really hot summers that are characteristic of the brief growing season in the northern Rocky Mountains. My group has also studied how salt moves into freshwater dependent wetlands in coastal North Carolina, the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula in particular. And we've also studied how climate change and human activities affect water availabilities, not only in North Carolina, but as far afield as central Honduras, where one of my students has his home and his home university. And so the lower right-hand picture is a shot of us installing some stream monitoring equipment in the tropical forest there in Honduras. And so at the same time, I want to acknowledge that I'm the first generation of Lumbees to be educated in integrated schools and to have access to resources and opportunities that were denied to the generation and generations before me because of our status as Indigenous peoples. Here you see some early photos from the school that is now UNC Pembroke. It was originally established as a teacher training school, a normal school for Indians in the state. And so I've carried this perspective with me throughout my education. And one of the things it's helped me to do is to recognize my own privilege as somebody who's really benefited from multiple generations of investments of my my ancestors, and always pushing for better education for their descendants. It's also helped me to see the ways that generations of discrimination against people of color in North Carolina and elsewhere have created a radically uneven playing field in the year 2020 in all kinds of areas: public health, education, the accrual of intergenerational wealth, and more. Formal institutions that sought to annihilate Native peoples from this region, the institutions that created slavery and segregation, it took many years to put into place, and they were entrenched in this country for a very long time. So it's naive to think that the end of the Civil War, or the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or the turning over of a new leaf in federal Indian policy would instantaneously erase these inequities. They persist to this very day. So to me personally, as a Lumbee academic, the struggle for racial justice is fundamentally a struggle to acknowledge that these inequities persist today, and to do what I can to help with the hard work of unwinding and disentangling the tendrils that permeate so much of society. And it's difficult because as an academic, I work within some of the very institutions that are responsible for some of these inequities. So it's a tenuous position. I want to say that much of the work that I found myself embedded in the past few years falls into the area of environmental justice, which again, I'm really pleased is a priority of your organization. Many of you may know this as the social movement that traces its modern roots to Warren County, North Carolina. So briefly, the photograph here was taken during protests in the predominantly African-American community of Afton in rural Warren County, where the state of North Carolina unilaterally decided that they would build a disposal facility for thousands of tons of contaminated soil that had been polluted with PCB, a carcinogen, as a result of illegal dumping of chemicals that originated from an industrial facility right here in the Triangle. I'm pretty sure that Ward Transformer, the company that generated all of that waste, actually was based around the area where Lake Crabtree is today. But at any rate, that movement began as the community stood up for themselves and said, no, you can't decide to put this here without our input. And it was a nexus of leaders from the civil rights movement, local community, and religious leaders coming together and say, we're going to take a moral and an ethical stand against this type of practice. And the modern environmental justice movement, as we know it, grew from that experience in Warren County and from others like it across, really across the world. Some of them have been documented and we know their stories, and others we do not. So in the years following Warren County, a field of research rose up alongside the social movement. It was focused on identifying racial disparities in the environment. These disparities could have to do with where do we put our polluting infrastructure? Why don't we put amenities like parks and natural areas in certain areas? And all too often, the data from this body of research showed that poor and minority communities shouldered the burdens for pollution, for environmental nuisances, that these communities didn't have equal access to desirable aspects of the environment, nature, parks, fresh air, clean water, etc. There's a quote at the bottom of this page from a 1987 report that was commissioned by the United Church of Christ, which sort of led the organizing around this movement and some of the early research. And I think that it makes a very important point. Both consciously and unconsciously, racism is enforced and maintained by legal, cultural, religious, educational, economic, political, environmental, and military institutions of society. These situations are not always, I would argue, not often the result of malice on the part of corporations or governments or individuals. The point of this quote is that racial disparities don't necessarily arise because individual planners or decision makers are personally racist. I'm personally convinced that they often arise because people take a colorblind approach to planning. So we're going to pick a site for this landfill or this pipeline or this hazardous facility based on what is inexpensive or convenient or profitable. However, the options that are often inexpensive, convenient, or profitable are that way because of decades or centuries of decisions that purposefully discriminated against people of color or against poor people. And so if decision makers in 2020 don't have their eyes wide open to race and social vulnerability, I'm convinced that they're bound to make decisions that reinforce the status quo that 30 years of research have shown actually do exist in the fabric of our landscapes in the United States and elsewhere. So a more recent example, some of you might have followed the work that I and many others did to raise awareness about racial disparities in the siting of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Here, Indigenous peoples were much more likely to live along the pipeline route than elsewhere in the surrounding region. And again, not a result of any ill intent on the part of planners or developers, just a colorblind approach to planning the route in a way that met other criteria, but didn't meet the criterion of actively working against the status quo of placing this type of infrastructure in vulnerable communities. In addition to the research that Amy mentioned during the introduction, I had a paper come out just a couple of weeks ago in a journal called Water. And if you go to this website, go.ncsu.edu/native environment, it will take you to a website that I administer that has links to all of these papers, including this most recent narrative about Indigenous participation in water governance that centers on this story of planning and permitting for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And that paper is accessible via that link for those of you who are interested in a long read on the subject. And I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the racial inequities surrounding the siting of the large gas compressor station attached to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in the predominantly African American community of Union Hill in Virginia. And so the people of Union Hill organized, even though it was not none of these communities, or at least none that I've encountered, are of one voice on any of these issues. They're obviously complex with different opinions and perspectives, but this community overwhelmingly organized against this disparate siting of infrastructure in their midst. And they were out on the front lines and really made a difference in the end. And so I think that the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline speaks to what happens when we don't actively look to address racial disparities in planning. So in picking the shortest, the cheapest, or most convenient route for a pipeline, you forgot to do one important thing, and that was to consider whether that route would place a disparate burden on the vulnerable or the disadvantaged communities in the region. And I think that there are ethical ramifications of not taking that into consideration. And there are certainly potential legal ramifications. And we saw this playing out with some of the court cases, like the one in Virginia that focused on air emissions associated with the compressor station that was slated for Union Hill. So now that you know a little bit about these racial disparities, I want to put it in the much larger context of climate change. So we see a similar phenomenon of racial and socioeconomic disparities emerging when we look at the economic challenges associated with climate change, both in the US and around the world. I'm going to show you some maps and figures from the United States, but do know that research confirms that these patterns repeat themselves around the world. So in the US, for example, we have fairly recent research on the economic damages of climate change on a county by county basis for the entire country. And I want to point out that these results that I'm about to show you are projected changes at the end of this century if we continue along our current path of emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So here, the colors show the fraction of the county's income that will be spent dealing with the negative impacts of climate change by the end of the century. The redder the color, the richer the color, the more of that county's income or GDP will be spent dealing with climate change. And these are in percents of county level GDP. Notice there are some greens on here. The green colors represent counties that will actually see projected boost in their economic situation as a result of climate change. These might be counties where the growing season is longer, where the winters are milder, but without concurrent intensification of summer heat. So maybe on the balance, you're saving energy over the course of the year. But if you look at the US as a whole, you can see that the losers, the counties in red or orange, vastly outweigh the winners, the counties in green. And so what makes a county a loser? What are the things that are costing them economically in terms of climate change? It's higher energy costs associated with air conditioning. It could be loss of agricultural income for rural counties. It's heat-related illness and the medical bills associated with intensification of heat. So all of these different factors, whether they are labor-related, whether they're health-related, agriculture-related, this model glommed all of those together and came out with these estimates of proportional losses for each county. And so not only do the red counties, the losers, outweigh the green counties, the winners, but it's not homogeneous, it's not uniformly distributed across the country. If you look at the counties that are going to experience the most intense damages due to climate change, they tend to be concentrated in the South. And if you look even more closely, many of these are lower income counties, including the so-called Black Belt of the southeastern US through the coastal plain of the southeastern states, where you have relatively high African American populations. I want to zoom in on North Carolina for a moment. And so I've pulled up the North Carolina portion of that map down in the lower part of the screen, and I superimposed it over a map of tribal nations in North Carolina. Now, these are not exact territorial boundaries. These are what we call service areas. So these are the counties where each tribe is entitled to provide services to tribal citizens that live in that area. And I want to point out that in North Carolina, the reddest counties are Robeson and Scotland County, and those correspond with the territory of the Lumbee tribe. And in fact, Robeson has the highest proportional expected losses due to climate change of any county in North Carolina. And I want to say it's something like 12% of the county's overall income, their gross domestic product, is going to be lost dealing with the negative impacts of climate change by the end of this century. And in fact, if you plot those percentages against the levels of poverty in each North Carolina county, you actually find this pretty strong relationship between poverty and the vulnerability to climate change damages. So Robeson County is not an isolated case. It happens to be out at the extreme because it is one of the poorest counties in North Carolina, if not the poorest, depending on your metric. So what other kinds of impacts could we see besides the ones that I've named so far? One in North Carolina that's included in this model are the damages due to catastrophic flooding. So other hard-hit counties in eastern North Carolina also have highly vulnerable populations. And I'll just point out, for example, Edgecombe County. You have communities such as Princeville. We'll see continued flooding as climate change continues to load the dice towards hurricanes that are slower and wetter, like Matthew and Florence in recent years. It's important to note that Princeville was the first town in the US incorporated by African Americans. Immediately at the end of the Civil War, formerly enslaved people founded this town, but they were not allowed to build on the high side of the Tar River. That's where present-day Tarboro is. If you look at the Tar River, you've got higher terrain on one side. That's where Tarboro lies. And on the other side, you have lower, swampier terrain. And that is where those newly freed citizens were allowed by their surrounding community to establish their town. So that's an example of going back many generations to see where overtly discriminatory practices set the stage for something like we see today, when Tarboro may be spared from flooding, but Princeville is actually hit pretty hard. It is protected by a levee, but that levee was not designed for the massive rainfall totals that we've seen with recent hurricanes. So elsewhere in eastern North Carolina, I've done some modeling for Lumbee territory to show that by the middle of this century, we expect to see summer temperatures that are much warmer on average than they were in the 1990s. That has ecological implications just for the climate that the plants and the crops will experience, the amount of water that they'll use, the amount of productivity that they'll be able to have during the growing season. But there is also a human impact as well. And so to give you one cultural implication, midsummer is when Lumbee people have their largest annual celebration, Lumbee Homecoming. So Saturday around the 4th of July. It's already hot there. In the middle of the summer, it's hot and humid. Now imagine a few decades from now when we add several degrees on average to that heat. It will certainly have implications for how we practice Lumbee Homecoming in the future and the measures that we have to take to protect ourselves from that heat. So I think that we see these same kinds of inequities playing out with COVID-19. And I would like to acknowledge that public health officials agree with this. I put a quote here from the CDC, and it says, long-standing systemic health and social inequities have put many people from racial and ethnic minority groups at an increased risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19. So that sounds very similar to the things that we have heard about climate change, about the siting of polluting infrastructure, and these other types of inequities. So systemic health and social inequities, making people more at risk and more susceptible to the impacts from this disease, from this pandemic that's frankly ravaging the United States right now and many other places around the world. So if we want to look at some cold, hard data, there are summaries of CDC data that have been done by a number of groups and researchers. Here are two, one from the Brookings Institution, one from the Kaiser Family Foundation. The Brookings Institution shows that African Americans in all age groups have a higher proportion of fatality than other groups. So here they've shown on the left-hand side white and Hispanic or Latino populations. The Kaiser Family Foundation has studied demographic data associated with the pandemic from Native American populations and shown that in 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming, There are larger fraction of cases among Native Americans than among the rest of the population. So we do see these disparities emerge, and we could think about what are the underlying factors that make populations and communities more susceptible to the conditions that we're actually seeing on the ground today. I'm not a public health person, so I can't do a deep dive or a deeper interpretation on that. I just want to point out that as a scientist, I see some echoes towards things that I'm more familiar with. You know, that we have these underlying conditions that are setting the stage for emergent properties that we see today, where the emergent property is the disparity, which we can quantify in graphs like this. I will point out one area of connection to the type of work that I do, I think is emerging on the Navajo Nation. I do not work on the Navajo Nation. I don't do research there. I do have some close collaborators doing research there, and I have read the news like many of you, and the center of the pandemic in the United States in recent days has really been in this part of North America on the Navajo Nation, which is an area of land that's roughly the size of the state of West Virginia. So this is a massive area of land, but it is massively under-resourced when it comes to things like water infrastructure. So there are many households on the Navajo Nation that do not have access to running water today in 2020. And so if the instructions are stay at home as much as possible, how do you stay at home as much as possible when you have to visit a communal watering source on a regular basis? Washing your hands frequently. How do you do that when water is a precious commodity that you have to travel far from home to access? So there are some connections here to these long-standing inequities. And I will point out the Navajo, like many Native nations throughout the United States, made agreements with either the U.S. government or colonial powers that preceded the U.S. To maintain these boundaries that we call reservations today, in exchange for basic services like water, like education, like other types of infrastructure. And when you hear Native peoples talk about broken treaties and unfulfilled promises, we can look at places like the Navajo Nation and think about the underdevelopment of drinking water. It's just one single example, but it's a very concrete example of the failure of the United States to honor those promises that it made to Native peoples in exchange for vast tracts of North America and the resources that were there that the United States wanted to take from Native people. So I want to end, I think that there are some ethical and moral considerations. I'm not a theologian and I'm not a philosopher, so I don't have a very sophisticated language to talk about these considerations. As a person of faith, I have my own traditions to draw from. I just want to end with some observations. I think first is very important to name the phenomenon of structural racism. This is the present day manifestation of policies, practices, and norms that emerge from historic and ongoing discrimination of minorities here in the US and elsewhere. We have to understand that it's not necessarily tied to ill will by individuals today, although individual racism absolutely exists. When we talk about structural racism, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. When it comes to environmental factors that are at play in these questions of structural racism, we've got to acknowledge that the patterns of where people live today and what they are exposed to in the environment were put in place decades or centuries ago. And the town of Princeville serves as a prime example of that, but there are many, many others. If we don't acknowledge that these inequities exist and have been baked into our society for a long time, then I'm convinced that we're bound collectively as a society to make decisions that will reinforce those inequities. So second, because these different phenomena, whether they're polluting infrastructure, climate change, or COVID-19 impact vulnerable communities disproportionately, we have to do everything that we can to stop them. So whether it's activism to stop a pipeline or a compressor station, whether it's advocating for public policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or whether it's practicing social distancing and other health habits, wearing your mask to stop the spread of COVID-19. We can work as individuals, and we can also work through our institutions, flawed as they may be, to stop the harms that exacerbate these underlying inequities. So my parting encouragement to all of you is that that we work to do both of these things with all of our might. We keep our eyes open to the existence of these inequities. We have to acknowledge them. Part of the healing and the reconstruction and the process of remaking and healing is to keep our eyes open and to acknowledge them where they exist. And we also have to fight the threats that make those inequities even worse. I know that these are only some of the things that are required to work towards a more just world, but I think that that's a good start. So I want to thank you all, and I hope we have some time for a discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ryan. That was amazing. We're so very fortunate to have you here tonight sharing all of this good information with us. We've had a lot of conversation and questions and kind of reflections going on in the chat box while you were speaking. And I think it certainly goes without saying that everyone was very much moved and inspired by what you've shared with us tonight. And I think in some instances, it opened people's eyes to things that they didn't realize were happening even here in North Carolina, like with the example in Princeville and the Navajo Nation. I read an article not too long ago that for the first time in its history, Doctors Without Borders was dispatched to the Navajo Nation in response to COVID-19, and that's the first time they've ever been dispatched in the United States. So that's really, I think indicative of what you were talking about with this huge problem. So, I mean, there are a litany of examples we could talk about tonight, but we'll go ahead and get to some of the questions. I think one of the first questions we received are, how are the geographical disadvantages like those in Princeville repeated in other counties, like Robeson County, for example? Were the Lumbees forced onto less desirable land like the folks in Princeville were?
Yeah, I would say that the timing was different from Princeville for Lumbee people, and the circumstances were different. But yes, certainly Native peoples from many different parts of eastern and central North Carolina were forced out of their traditional lands, which were everywhere. And they were forced to retreat into these places that offered them safety and refuge. And the trade-off for that safety and that refuge is that those places were potentially more flood prone. The farmland might have been less fertile than their traditional lands. And any number of reasons that would have made those lands less desirable to colonial powers. So in the case of Lumbee people, yes, we did find fertile farmland amid those swamps and rivers, but that was a tiny fraction of our traditional lands. And you do see this pattern repeated across the coastal plain, where the high side of the river is occupied by, to be frank with you, the white side of town, and then African Americans Native Americans, increasingly Latinx and Hispanic people are isolated in what might have been the poor side of town historically, and is just less well protected from flooding than places like Tarboro or Lumberton. So this is a pattern that repeats itself because of the physical geography of how our rivers meander through the eastern part of the state.
Great. And so Lynn had a question specifically about ICCT, and for ICCT, if we were looking and we want to partner with a group of people currently being disproportionately impacted by environmental or climate change, are there groups in the Triangle that or surrounding counties that you would advise us to connect with, or that it would make sense for us to work with? You know, and I think it goes back to the question that I think we all have is, what can we do? What can we leave here and do tomorrow? Like, if we're going to leave, what's the first thing we should do tomorrow when we leave here?
I do think it's important to work through frontline institutions and communities that that desire engagement. And one way to do that appropriately, you have public-facing organizations like the NC Environmental Justice Network, that coordinates lots of communities and lots of issues across North Carolina that are related to environmental justice. And I feel like they would be a really good organization for connecting with communities. The name escapes me. I really apologize, but Mr. Omega Wilson in, I believe, Alamance County has an organization that focuses on development issues sort of in that I-85 area between here and Greensboro. His organization would be another point of contact. But I think that for organizations like yours to first connect with other organizations would be a good step. And maybe you are already coordinated with these folks, but I would trust organizations like that to have their pulse on the community and make sure that if you have resources or efforts that you want to put into restoring justice in North Carolina, that they are directed in areas where those communities who really have a sense for what's happening in the field can weigh in and help guide those resources to where they're most needed.
All right, thank you. I know we have a number of folks joining us tonight that were actively involved in the fight against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and I know they appreciate your work, and I've seen a few of them pop in and out during the call tonight. So I know they really appreciate your work, and I think that provided a bright spot for us during, an otherwise pretty dark time when we're dealing with COVID. So do you have any evidence-based hope for a better future for Indigenous people in North Carolina? Are things going to get better soon, hopefully?
I don't know what soon is, but I'm an optimist, and I saw some movement in the public policy realm during the Atlantic Coast Pipeline battle that encouraged me. I feel like in North Carolina, at least, our state level leaders are beginning to take tribes more seriously as native nations. So my co-author and colleague on this recent paper, Dr. David Wilkins, will often use the term native nations to remind us that these are sovereign nations that existed before the United States and held territory and governed themselves. And it seems like in recent years that the state, at least, is beginning to take that nationhood aspect of our tribes a little more seriously. And that's a really big step. If you follow news about tribes in North Carolina, you know that my tribe and other tribes are pursuing federal recognition. The Eastern Band of Cherokee is currently the only tribe in North Carolina with full federal recognition. And you know that recognition affords respect that goes well beyond a casino or access to Indian health services or other financial resources. It affords you a government to government relationship with the United States. And in many cases, it affords you treatment as a state in things like administration of the Clean Water Act. And so those are really big, scary things, I think, for responsibilities for a tribe to take on. But I think that those are challenges that would be great for tribes in North Carolina to have. And I do feel like there's some movement in that direction, at least in the way that the state government interacts with tribes here in North Carolina.
And the fight you were mentioning, to be seen as a sovereign nation for the Lumbees has been one that's gone on for decades now, correct?
Yes, more than a century. So since the 1880s.
Wow, I just can't even fathom that. Another question that's come up, and so do Native Americans, Indigenous people have the right to vote, and are there polling places, I guess, near the land where the people live?
Yeah, I would say our voting access in Lumbee territory is on par with other rural communities throughout the South. All of the benefits and all of the hazards thereof. So I would say in terms of voting access, there are always the sort of the local peculiarities. But yes, as a people, Native Americans have the right to vote, and we have polling places, distributed as the counties have resources. But again, we're talking about some of the poorest counties in the state, if not the region.
So, and I know that you didn't touch on this, so this is going to kind of come at you kind of unaware, but the wood pellet plant, that there's been a lot of conversation and talk about that. Are members of the tribe involved in that conversation, or has that just been kind of thrust upon the community there for y'all to deal with?
People are involved because it has been thrust upon them. And so I believe the tribe has weighed in with a resolution expressing concern over not only the air quality impacts, but the way that the permitting process was handled. And there are a number of individual Native people who are very active on this matter as well. So I want to point out that tribes deserve the ability to weigh in on these permitting issues as governments, but you also have individual citizens who may or may not be members of a tribe who are also participating as individuals in these processes. I will say one encouraging thing. There was a statement issued by Secretary Regan immediately after the air permit was issued for this wood pellet plant in Lumberton. It was a very encouraging statement. It wasn't explicitly attached to the air permit, but Secretary Regan said that he acknowledged there is a problem when marginalized communities first hear about a major proposal for a facility like this in the mid-late stages of permitting. So that's something that people have been trying to raise to the level of our state leaders for a very long time. And to hear the secretary express concern over that was quite encouraging. I don't know what policy changes may emerge from that, but at least we know that the head of this agency now thinks that is a problem.
That is, take what you can get as far as encouragement, right? So another question that's come in: what is your number one challenge to us that you would leave us with tonight?
Those are the kinds of questions I'm not good at. It's really hard for me to put forward challenges or recommendations for people. I guess I would say one thing, maybe not the number one thing, but one thing that I can put in very precise and concrete language is think very carefully about what you mean when you use the word disparity or disproportionality. These are they're technical words that have a meaning, right? A disparity means that one group has a proportionally higher impact or proportionally higher susceptibility than the surrounding population. And that's a really powerful concept. And it's really important for demonstrating things like environmental injustices. But I want people to use those terms when they see them or when they verify them with data. But I do fear that if we use those terms too loosely, they could lose the power that they have. And maybe that might be kind of a controversial statement, but I really think that those are powerful concepts, and they deserve to be afforded like the power that they contain. And one way that we can do that is if we're going to use the word disproportionality, let's make sure that we can back it up with some numbers.
Perfect. We've had a question. The link you referenced during your presentation, can you either share that with folks, or can we type that into the chat box here for anyone, for everyone to see? So that, oh, perfect. You beat me to the punch. Fantastic.
Yeah, that is the Native Environment website is a non-NC State website that is sort of a clearinghouse for information that might be of relevance to Native peoples in North Carolina and beyond. I'm going to put a second link that is to my NC State website. So both of those websites will have links to publications, but the Native Environment one has some more general interest information as well, some blog posts and news items and things like that.
And one final question for you. What are you looking most forward to over the next year as you're spending your time in RTP as a humanities award recipient?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm really excited to learn more of the research methods of an historian. So I'm really excited about some of the documentary research that I've been able to do to date. A lot of it has to do with just digging through decades-old newspaper articles from places like Rocky Mount and Lumberton, reading about these environmental issues in an era before we had the language that we use today of environmental justice. It really takes some work to kind of read between the lines to understand what's happening with infrastructure development in the 1940s and 1950s in North Carolina. And so I've got some learning to do to be an accurate interpreter of that history, but it's a fun challenge and I'm really looking forward to more of that.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got this evening. If you have any other things you'd like to add, you're certainly welcome to. If not, we'll turn it over to Charles, and he's going to close this out.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was a remarkable presentation. I learned so much, and I've grown up in North Carolina around the territory you're describing, and I learned things I did not know. So thank you. It was wonderful. So I'm pleased to be representing the Orange Chatham Interfaith Care for Creation group. It's another group organized over in the two counties I just recognized. And this is our fourth opportunity, I think, Lynn, to join with ICCT and the Campaign for Nonviolence North Carolina in putting on some remarkable events, which we appreciate the opportunity of doing so. So we came into existence about 5 months after ICCT in March 2019. 3 faith communities in the Chapel Hill area, St. Thomas More Catholic Church, Binkley Baptist Church, and the Community Church of Chapel Hill, convened around the idea of forming some kind of earth ministry organization of faith communities in our area. And that led eventually to the formation, our formative meeting, in fact, on May 28th of just last year at St. Thomas More, to gauge the interest of other faith communities, not just Christian, not just Catholic and Protestant, but Jewish community and others. And that interest exceeded all of our expectations. So there was a pent-up desire in the same way that Lynn and her group in Raleigh has found there's such an interest in a desirability of having this conversation in the faith community. So OCICC currently has over 154 people who have been involved in different activities of the organization since we had that very first meeting. And some of those pre-COVID events included hosting different faith communities engaged in programs around what are they doing in their earth ministries, creation care programs in their own congregations. One very exciting program was on triple stream collection systems for composting, recycling, and proper disposal. We had a terrific program at UCC on solar energy, and we had a program on climate justice with William Barber III, which was very interesting. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, as I mentioned, we've co-hosted with ICCT and Campaign for Nonviolence on programs such as this. And such as this, they're all been unique and all very interesting. So OCICC is guided by an 8-person steering committee. I'm a member of that steering committee, and there are others that are on this program right now, watching and participating from different faith and retirement communities. You know, Chapel Hill is a huge retirement center, and so our retirement communities are also represented in our organization. But together, the steering committee has crafted a mission statement which reads, the OCICC seeks to engage people of faith, congregations, and communities to become better stewards of the earth, to address climate change, and advocate for environmental justice for all life on earth. And so, Ralph, if you would show our slide, we had a sort of an online retreat this spring, and so we have so many things we want to do, but we narrowed it down to these 3 large buckets. One is to advance our own organization, to grow its health, its vitality, expand its diversity and commitment itself. But then for action, to promote, in this case, local policy changes, more earth-friendly policies, composting and different things, and advocate for local food production and consumption. Our third area is to collaborate and partner with others, such as this very evening, and also sort of the mother of all of us, the Interfaith Power and Light, and to support various environmental advocacy groups. So it's a new idea, but there are other groups like this cropping up all over this state and all over the United States, and we're looking forward to being established and deepen our partnerships. So the second thing I have an opportunity to do is to, oh, by the way, you can learn more about us on our Facebook page. I didn't post that link, come to think of it, but please go in there. So Ralph, if you would, I have the opportunity now to engage you in a meditation and a reflection on what we've just heard in this wonderful program tonight. And so this meditation really comes from this book. It's a book about a particular person, a Santee tribe native Indian of Dakota Sioux. His name was Elisha. He lived from 1858 to 1939. He was a remarkable person. And so I've read this book. It's a short read, as you can see. And these are some quotes. The worship of the great mystery is solitary. There are no temples or intermediaries or necessary. The work of the great creator surrounds us with a temple of natural beauty, from the rising sun until moon and stars at night. For the first people, it would be a sacrilege to build a house for the one who may be met face to face in the mysterious, shadowy aisles of the primeval forest, in the bosom of virgin prairies, upon dizzy spires of naked rock, and in the vast jeweled vault of the night sky. Our worship of the Maker is silent. There are no creeds or dogma, nor is there meddling with the religious experience of others. We stand alone in silence and in reverent appreciation for the beauty and abundance of the holy creation that surrounds us all. Our worship of the Spirit is free and self-seeking, and free of self-seeking and self-centeredness. Given the abundance given freely to us by our Maker, we have not sought to accumulate wealth and excessive goods. Nor do we believe that only humans have souls. Whether self-aware or not, all life possesses soulness, and we are respectful of their place in creation. We humbly accept the sacrifice of their bodies to preserve our own and pay homage to their spirits. Natural beauty in our eyes is always fresh and living, even as God, the great mystery, dresses the world anew each season of the year, summer, fall, winter, and spring. So for the first peoples, every day is an earth day, and every day is in worship to the Great Spirit. And I want to thank all of you. We want to all thank all of you for joining us tonight for this outstanding program Dr. Ryan Emanuel just presented, and for Dan Bell, and for making it a very special evening, for your questions and your interest and your engagement. So we encourage you to be safe and be well, and good evening.